We're going to use Blazedpath cloud services to make the build and deploy to the cloud. We're going to integrate to the repository where the code is going to be. We will create a pipeline and generate the build, and we're going to make the deploy in the environment of our choice. If you remember, our solution has a default environment configuration that we set up for our testings. In that environment, we had a mock database configured, but when we do the first deploy, we are going to have a real database, which will be empty by default. Blazedpath allows database links to a particular environment, which can then be used by any of our solutions. These databases will always persist the information, unlike the memory mock database that Blazedpath uses in the local suite. So we are going to need to add some topics and quizzes for the real database on the first deploy to avoid doing the process manually from the front end. So let's go back to the suite and create a new configuration called empty database. In here, we are going to add the values of the config parameters. And we are also going to have an empty mock database. We are making this an environment to simulate the first deploy on an empty database, which will happen when we do the first cloud deploy on the real database. So let's execute the solution and make sure that there is no data on the topics or quizzes. To fill the empty database, we are going to create two JSON files, which are going to have the default registers for the topics and quizzes that will later be inserted. So let's go to the microservice and add a resource folder. In here, we are going to have two JSON files. The first one, it's going to be called default topics.json, and we are going to do a quick copy and paste of the contents of the mock database from the other environments. And as you can see, it has the topic ID for the quizzes references that will be added later. The second file, default quizzes.json, we are going to do another copy paste, and we can see the reference topic ID we just saw with the question and the answer fields and the right answers. We have in this file the 250 quizzes we wrote for the mock database. With these two files, we can create a database with some default data if they haven't been added already. Next, we will create a function called initialize quizzes database that, if no data is found, will add the default entries to the topics and quizzes. First, we are going to check for the list of topics. We're going to declare a variable of list of topics, do the retrieval with a set equals list topics of null, and to store the results on the topics variable. Now check if the results has any hits, so we can skip the data entry. Now to declare the list of quizzes variables. If we don't have any topics, we will have to read the topic files and quizzes using the load resource plugin and store the data on the variables. And now to iterate on the topics to insert them in the database. To be able to reference the quizzes with the created topic ID, we will create a variable to store a list of the topics ID from the JSON and the topic ID from the database. Basically, a list of tuples or pairs of strings and integers. We will call this variable topics IDs. and initialize it as an empty list. Now create another variable to iterate on the topics of type topics. And now we're going to use a for each blocky to do the iteration and insert the topics IDs, the tuple formed by the topic ID from the JSON with convert to string of topic.topicID, and the result of the created topic on the database from the create topic endpoint. Now we have to start creating the quizzes, so we need the variable to use for the iteration. It's going to be quiz of type quiz. Next, we need to update the topic ID from the quiz that we have on the JSON file for the quizzes with the one we got from the database insert. And we are getting this one from the list of tuples or pairs. So drag a blocky set and select quiz.topicID. Search for the first topic with a match on the topics IDs list. And the condition is the first element of the tuple is equal to the topic ID from the quiz iteration variable. The find first will return a tuple or pair, so we are going to use the second element marked with the index equals 1 on the array. Finally, we use the create quiz function to persist the quiz on the database. The last step is to call the function on the start of the microservice so it can initialize the database with the default data if needed. So create an onStart event on the microservice and execute the function initialize quizzes database. If we run the solution and we go to the database modeler, we can see how the database is already up with the information from the insert. And now if we open the web application and we can check the quizzes and the topics from the admin pages. And the same thing for the mobile application. We can see the inserted records there. So let's now stop the servers and change back to the default environment so we can have information by default. And as you can see, we don't get any additional topics or quizzes. And that's thanks to our validation in here that checks if there is already records on the database, meaning it's already initialized. Now that we are done with that, we need to access the Blazedpath cloud services. So we are going to go to the URL cloud.blazepath.com. And if you have never logged in, it will ask for the user and password. And if you still don't have an account, please use the register link to create a Blazedpath account. Once you are logged, you will be presented with a screen to access the download center. From here, you can download the Blazedpath versions for your device, and you can see the release notes for each version. We can also access the full documentation of the platform here. And finally, we can go to the cloud services of Blazedpath. When you click here, you will see all the associated working accounts to your user account. And in our case, we are going to use our Blazedpath tutorial account. Once we access the working account, on the top, you can see the account information and the available credits to use on the cloud. On the left side, we can see all the accesses to the different sections concerning deploys. So let's go over quickly on the menu entries. Here we have the repository menu. And here you are going to set up the links to Git repositories where we saved our workspaces. In the pipelines, we are going to configure actions to be performed on our executions. In the execution sections, you can start the executions, selecting the repositories and the pipelines. On builds, you can find all the elements generated by the executions. In environments, you can set up different deploy environments where the solutions will be deployed and executed. In security, we can add, generate AP keys necessary to execute requests from outside our cloud environments and the passwords for the Docker images that are generated by the build. Members contain a list of all the members associated to the working account with the options to invite new users if you are an admin. And finally, on usage, you will find details of the uses for credits and deploys, storings, services, and database executions on each environment. Now, our first task to do a full deploy cycle is to add our Git repository. We previously pushed our code to a GitHub repo, so now we are going to copy the repo and click on code, then on the icon, and now go back to the Blazedpath Cloud Services and we click on Create New, copy the URL, and then click on Accept. Now for the pipelines, this is going to be a number of steps that we execute from a repository on the executions menu. By default, we have two pipelines, one for the full build and deploy, and the other to do a redeploy of our last successful build. We can push create new and make our own pipelines. Since we want to do a build and deploy, we're going to use the already available and configure it with our information. So let's click on edit, and we can see the first step, the build, is set up to use the master branch. The second step will make the deploy on the development environment. Now let's change the environment configuration from master to main, since it's the one GitHub uses as default and the one on our repo. So click on the three dots, click edit. When the window's opened, we can change master to main. And finally, we leave the development environment that comes by default, since we are going to use the one for the deploy. Before starting the execution, we will go to the development environment and create the relational database for the quizzes. So click on the environment menu and we select development. We can see the current deploys and other options for authorization servers, relational, and Mongo databases. We click on the plus to add on the relational databases for our quizzes, and we are going to give it the name quizzes.db. Now that we have our database in the development environment, we are ready for our first pipeline. So let's go to the executions and click on Start Execution. We will have to select the repo which is going to be quizzes, tutorials, and then pipelines. We're going to choose build and deploy. We click on OK and wait for the build to finish. We can click on the refresh button here so you can check for the execution status. Once the build is done, we can see the execution requests to configure the deploy of our solution. But first, we will check the builds menu. We can see in here all the repos that we used for the build and information on how much space they use. If we go to our repo, we can see a build ID, the build, the date it was done, the version that comes from the package.json on the workspace, and the git commit ID from which the build was generated, along with the disk size used by the build. If we check build details, we can see the workspace, and we can download the build and do manual deploys from outside the Blazedpath ecosystem if you wish to, using the pm2 or the Docker's files. In the readme.md, you can find all the information regarding these approaches, so you are not logged onto our ecosystem. So once the build is done, we are going to focus on the deploy. We can see that before the deploy is done, a user action is required. We need to set up the config parameters from our solution before it can be deployed. We must also set a subdomain for the admin web application that we're going to use. We're going to call it quizzes admin. And we can also configure resources through the quota to guarantee the availability through the replicas of our server. We will leave this with the default values. The mobile app subdomain is going to be named quizzes games. We will also set the config parameters of the mobile app. And the ones for the microservice as well. And finally, we will select the database we just created for this environment. And once we are done with all the config, we click on the resume execution and we wait for the deploy to finish. At this point, we can see the details of the execution and see a timeline with all the actions and the outputs. Once the execution is completed, we can see the outputs, the domains configured, the Kubernetes files, and the .apk files for the Android mobile devices. Once the deploy is completed for our solution, we can go to the environments and we can see the deployed build. If we expand the information, we can see the domains, the build details, and the options to download the Kubernetes and APK files. On the top section, we can see the availability of our environment, which can show what days and timeframes the services will be available. You can save on costs if you restrict this time frame whenever the connectivity is not necessary. You can also see an estimation of the weekly credit costs of your current configuration. Now let's try and test our deployed application. And for that, we downloaded the APK files and installed it in our mobile device. So next, we will test the web application with the provided URL. And as you can see, all the topics and quizzes have been loaded. The rankings do not show any entries. As for the mobile app, we are going to create a game. Use the name John Doe, topic general knowledge, and start playing rounds. If we now go to the admin portal and we check on the played games, we can see the current one. Now let's keep playing from the phone. And when we are done, we can see the achieved score. And now we check on the web application for the games and rankings, checking for the end of game condition. And we can see it's already on the rankings. So now that we are done with the whole life cycle for the project, we have seen how the build and deploy of our application using the Blazedpath cloud services and checking that everything was working on our finished product. The web application, the mobile application, the microservice, and the database.